So I saw this fascinating TED Talk. I don't know if all of you know about TED.com. It's TED, just like the name TED, like Bill and Ted. TED.com, and there's just thousands of fascinating speeches given on there by the some of the smartest people in the world. And one of them reminded me of a whole network of people on YouTube and different discussions that I've witnessed or taken part in. And one of them I remember was non-union labor, who was doing a reply to Professor Anton about you know our genetics being sort of the ground level. So sort of the ground level of determining who you are, or your genetics. You can't get beyond that, and it seems like an obvious fact, but it gets more complicated than that. As I realized, as I listened to this TED Talk by, and I'm sure I'm saying this wrong, Nicholas Christakis. And Nicholas is talking about our embeddedness within social networks. And he's got some pretty solid scientific data. It's both theoretical and empirical, and he uses a computer model to show over time how relationships within a network in a society um, how they change over time and how they affect different individuals as they are born and as they die and as uh, well, there are many factors that he shows, but I just want to read a little bit from his talk where he says, at one point, you think that the speaker is going to sort of turn neo-Darwinian on you and start talking about memes or genes or something passing through this social structure. But then he says that depending on where you are in a social network, says different structural locations in the network have different implications for your life. And in fact, when we did some experiments looking at this, what we found is that 46% of the variation in how many friends you have is explained by your genes. And this is not surprising. We know some people are born shy, some people are born gregarious. That's obvious. But we also found some non-obvious things. For instance, 47% in the variation in whether your friends know each other is attributable to your genes. Okay, so 40% of the variation that determines whether your friends know each other depends not on their genes, depends on your genes. Now this starts to sound a little more complicated than just your genes determine who you are. The, the social structure around you is intertwined and tied together in these structural knots and loops such that your genes do not limit you. The people around you, their genes, in interaction with your genes, is really what produces what it means to be a human being as far as genes go. I mean, that's just, I mean, I think that sticking with genes, I think it's been shown that uh, genes are highly, let's say, uh, there's a lot of variation in how the morphogenetic processes of an organism unfold, depending on how the genes interact with the environment. And of course, genes can't turn themselves on or off, right? Or DNA can't, is not the brain of a cell. It's actually the membrane, which is sort of which is utilizing the DNA, if you will, in the cell. So he says 40%, 47% in the variation whether your friends know each other is attributable to your genes. Whether your friends know each other has not just to do with their genes, but with yours. And we think the reason for this is that some people like to introduce their friends to each other, you know who you are, and others of you keep them apart and don't introduce your friends to each other. And so some people knit together the networks around them, creating a kind of dense web of ties in which they're comfortably embedded. And finally, We've even found that 30% of the variation in whether or not people are in the middle or on the edge of a network can be attributed to their genes. So whether you find yourself in the middle or the edge is partly heritable. So now we've got history starting to play a big role. And he says, now what's the point of this? How does this help? How does this help us understand? How does this help us figure out some of the problems that are affecting us these days? Well, the argument I'd like to make is that networks have value. They're a kind of social capital. Now, new properties emerge because our embeddedness in social networks, and these properties in here, in the structure of the networks, not just in the individuals themselves, or not just in the individuals within them. These properties in here within the network structure itself, not in the individuals. So think about two common objects, and he shows it in the video. There's a piece of carbon and a diamond. They're both made up of the same stuff, but depending on the structure, you get two totally different emergent properties. You get the emergent diamonding or diamondness emerges in one structure, and carbonness or the universe is carboning in another structure. So it's not about what you have, it's the way that what you have is organized, and out of that emerges certain properties, different patterns, interconnections. Yeah, so the hardness and the softness, these things don't reside in the carbon, they reside in the interconnections between the carbon atoms, just like in society. And the last thing I'll say is that he says it's not so much what's happening to these people. He says, okay, this is the most profound part, I think, of it. I think of the entire speech. He says, now look at this. Our experience of the world, our phenomenological experience of the world is saying. He's saying our being in the world, in the Heideggerian sense, depends on the actual structure of the networks in which we're residing and on the kinds of things that ripple and flow through that network. Think about that. You think of yourself as the center, but what if you're just sort of the conduit through which the ripples and flows are 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 sort of passing through, and which you're also generating and sort of deflecting and harboring and amplifying, you know? I mean, this is a different way of thinking, starting with the whole instead of starting with the individual. You start sort of like, instead of starting with an atomistic sensation that hits my eye to understand visual perception, I start with a field, and then I can understand vision much better. Anyhow, he says, this is, I think, the most important thing he says, is after he says that our experience of the world depends on yada yada. Now, the reason I think that this is the case is that human beings assemble themselves and form a kind of superorganism. Now, superorganism is a kind of collection of individuals which show or evince behaviors or phenomena that are not reducible to the study of individuals and must be understood by reference to and by the study and by studying the collective, like, for example, a hive of bees, that's fine, etc., etc. He goes on, and at the very end of the talk, he says something which is it's not even in just any kind of opposition. It is in a diametrical, I think, opposition between what do not God and all of these, I don't know, I guess they're kind of pessimists. They think that they're kind of tough realists that can just, say, the world sucks, and then they'll just sit back in their chair, as Susan Neiman said, that, it's kind of a cowardly thing to be a pessimist. You say, oh, the world sucks, nothing's going to change, there's no hope of getting better, and then you just sit back and you absolve yourself of any responsibility because you've already given up on the world. But what this guy says is that human social networks form because goodness spreads through them. Without social networks, you cannot spread goodness. And without goodness, you couldn't keep social networks together. I advise you guys, please watch this video on TED.com. I'm going to put a link up to it. And if you go to TED.com and type in the hidden influence of social networks, you can find